Hi everyone. I want to talk a little bit about budgeting today and some of the different types. Budgeting is one of those things that everybody should do at least once to better understand their finances and their expenses. And most of us should probably do it consistently on a month-to-month basis. But there's a lot of different budget types out there.
I see the budget's gotten bigger. Thanks.
And it can be quite confusing for someone sitting down to do their budget for the very first time. I wanted to walk through some of those different budgets today, talk about some of the different aspects, benefits, pros and cons to help you get started on the right foot. All right, so the first budget I want to talk about today is known as the $0 budget.
But we don't have the money.
And this is a budget that can find a home for most everybody, regardless of your attitudes towards spending or money. The idea behind this budget is you take your monthly income, you subtract out your expenses before the month even begins, and you're left with $0. Literally every dollar, all the money that you bring in for the month is already accounted for before you even begin that budget period. One of the other benefits is that it also forces you to pre-plan and be intentional with where your money is going. Before the budget period even begins, you've already thought about, where am I putting long-term investments? Where am I doing charitable giving? It forces you to be intentional. Now, one of the downsides with a zero budget is that it is quite time intensive. You need to be intentional and sit down prior to the budget period beginning. Think through where your expenses coming from and meticulously assign each category the money so that it bounces out at the end of the month.
This isn't how I was planning to spend my evening.
And then it also requires a follow-up of you tracking those expenses to see how you ended up at the end of the month. Okay, next I wanted to talk about what's known as the 50-30-20 budget. Now, this one is a great budget for beginners because instead of having a dozen or more different categories that you're having to assign a monetary amount to at the beginning of each month, you've only got three. You have the 50 category, which is where you're going to have your necessary expenses. These are the things you can't live without. Your mortgage, this is your grocery bill, this is your water, utilities. The next category is 30. This is for your non-essential stuff, the stuff that you want to go camping, you have the money to go do that. This is maybe that extra purse or those shoes that maybe you wanted to buy. Finally, you have that 20, and that 20 is the long-term spending, or if you've got some debt, you're working to pay down that debt. Now, one of the downsides with the 50-30-20 is that if you live in an area where there's a high amount that's required to live there, high living expense, or let's say maybe you're coming to the table with a lot of debt already, you're probably behind the eight ball in that 20% category, and that 50-30-20 budget is shot before you even began. Okay, the next budget I want to talk about is known as the envelope budget.
Jury duty, jury duty, jury duty, blackmail, pink slip, pain letter, exit notice, jury duty.
Now, this is a budget that is perhaps the most restrictive of all of the budgets we'll end up talking about today, and it takes the basic principles of your $0 budget and uses the physical money in envelopes or jars or whatever system you use to separate out those categories. You put the money into those envelopes at the beginning of each month, and that's the money that you have to spend for the remainder of that month. It forces you to take a hard look at how much that you're spending, and it's very easy to tell when you're overspending because that money comes out of that envelope really, really fast.
Please, sir, I want some more.
What?
One other downside to this type of a budget is that it might be weird for those of us who are used to not carrying cash around. If you're used to carrying your debit card around, it's not going to work very well. It can be quite inconvenient in this very digital world. So this last category of budget is what is called the no budget or the anti-budget. The anti-budget is what we would consider to be more of a guideline or an approach to your spending.
The code is more what you call guidelines than actual rules.
Basically, the concept is you start out with your monthly income and how much you're going to bring in. You've pre-subtracted out the amount that you have for your required expenses, and then everything that's left is just extra spending. You get to choose without having the restriction on where those funds are going to end up going. If you want to spend $50 here, as long as you've already accounted for the required expenses, you're good to go. With this type of budget, you really need to keep track of those recurring required expenses so that way you make sure you have enough money in your checking account when those bills do come due. One of the other downsides that I see to this type of a budget is that it's very easy to go from one month to the next without making a lot of changes. And that can both be a blessing and a curse. If you're not thinking strategically and long term, you can miss some financial objectives or priorities that might come up ad hoc that you weren't planning into. One of the nice things though about the anti-budget is that if you have a checking account set up, the amount of money you have is really what is based within that checking account at any given time. So we talked earlier about the benefits of budgeting, and we talked about it in regards to mental health. We talked about it in regards to debt, long-term planning. There's a lot of really great reasons to budget. But here's what I know, and with my experience with budgeting, is it's really difficult to live a disciplined life and to intentionally plan and lean into creating a budget from one month to the next. There's no one exact budget that everybody should use. And what I would encourage is to experiment. Maybe there's actually a mix of some different pieces of each of the budgets that works really well for you and your family. In closing, I would say stick to your budget. You'll be glad of the sacrifices that you're making now as you see you progress towards your financial objectives in the years to come.